Dear students, welcome to today's lecture. Today we are going to discuss justice, Plato's critique of earlier notions and his own theory of justice. Objectives: to understand the Socratic principle of virtue is knowledge, to understand and discuss earlier theories of justice and their limitations, to understand the theory of justice propounded by Plato, to understand the possible flaws in Plato's theory of justice. In the Republic, Plato tries to explain two important, highly interrelated but very simple questions. In the first instance, Plato tried to explain and answer what a good man was and how can a good man be made. But since Greeks could not imagine a good man without being a member of a community or state, for they believed that a good man must be a member of a state and could be made good only through membership of a state. Therefore, a good man and a good state are interrelated and interdependent on one another. But one can ask, what is the good state and how is the good state made? Plato answers, a good man is one who knows and follows the natural station of his soul, meaning thereby, a good man is a just man. Similarly, a good state is a state composed and administered by good men. It is a state that is arranged on the principle of justice. But what is justice? The entire Republic is framed to answer this question. The Republic tells us that the discussion about the concept of justice is occurring in the house of Cephalus, and Plato uses the dialectic method whereby he decides to listen to the different theories of justice propounded by the participants, refuting them, and then at the end propounds his own theory. Therefore, before dealing with Plato's theory of justice, we must first try to understand different theories propounded by other participants in the dialogue. The first theory, conventional or traditional theory of justice. This theory is propounded by Cephalus and his son Polemarchus and is regarded as the traditional theory of justice. It is the theory which underlies traditional morality. Cephalus is credited with starting this theory when he stated that justice is telling the truth and giving back anything that has been borrowed. To show the shortcomings of Cephalus's definition, Plato challenges it by coming to a number of untenable conclusions. Realizing and accepting the fallacy of his definition, Cephalus left debate. But Polemarchus, son of Cephalus, carried on the discussion in the absence of his father. Polemarchus changed his father's definition of justice and defined justice as granting each man his proper due. During the conversation, the term proper was further stretched to imply that justice is a skill or ability that bestows good upon allies and evil upon adversaries. In response, Plato argued that if justice is an art or capacity, then it is capable of doing two opposite things, just like other arts or capacities. For example, the doctor with the greatest ability to prevent also possesses the greatest ability to cause diseases. Likewise, the best camp guardian has the greatest ability to steal. If justice is an ability or accomplishment, then it can be applied in both ways. A just man will have the same capacity to protect or steal a deposit. Similarly, a just man can play to be just or unjust at will. Plato goes on to question the definition, saying that while it is simple to talk about doing good to friends and evil to enemies, what happens when a friend is actually an enemy and only appears to be one? Plato then poses few more questions to Polemarchus. Is it ever right to treat enemies badly, regardless of what is said about treating friends well? As a result of these repercussions, Polemarchus is forced to give up on his conception of justice as the practice of doing good to one's friends and bad for adversaries. Plato comes to the conclusion that only an absolute monarchy or a tyrant must have created such a definition of justice. It can also be said that once we start to doubt who our allies and adversaries are, this definition of justice stops serving as a guidance. According to Plato, justice is not a technique, rather a quality of soul and a habit of mind. Once someone possesses these qualities and habits, they can only act in a certain way, which is never to harm other people or make a man friend or foe worse off. Finally, the concept of service is implied by true justice, and that in turn connotes the idea of a social whole to which that service is rendered. Radical theory of justice. This theory of justice was propounded by Thrasymachus, a radical sophist. According to his explanation, justice is the interest of the stronger, by which he means that the ruling class in any state will use force to compel its subjects to act in a way that serves its own interests. A democratic government enacts democratic laws. A tyrannical government enacts tyrannical laws, and so on. Justice is what is the interest of the rulers. The nature of the state may differ, but the interests will never change. Thrasymachus held that morality was nothing more than the exacting code of conduct. He continued by saying that a state protects its interests by enforcing these laws. In other words, a state declares just what is in its own best interests, and through its superior strength, it applies laws and labels them just. Justice, therefore, implies application of such laws, and the strongest will almost always succeed in doing so. In a state, for example, the government is the most powerful entity and will make every effort to obtain what is desired. In refuting this definition, Plato notes that the issue with it is that if justice truly is defined as whatever serves the ruler's interests, then for everyone else, justice can also be defined as per common definition as another's good. In the popular sense, acting in a way that pleases the ruler is considered unjust, whereas acting in a way that pleases oneself is considered just. Thrasymachus was caught off guard because he had no justification for why it was fair for the ruler to get his way while it was unfair for others to follow suit. What is real about one applies to others. Plato reveals Thrasymachus' conception of justice to be seriously flawed in several ways while critiquing him. Plato asks Thrasymachus, "Is it not true that those in power make mistakes? And will the powerful not violate the principle that the use of their power is for their own self-interest if they inadvertently pass laws that hurt them?" And Thrasymachus agreed to all of this. However, by consenting to Plato, he has unintentionally accepted the fundamental Plato's tenet that knowledge, not power, is the virtue of statesmanship, since it is obvious that knowledge is necessary to prevent errors. According to Plato, being a statesman is a craft, much like curing illness or show making, for example, which demands expertise and is done for the subject rather than the artist. As Socrates once said, art is not for the artist, but for the thing it touches. Plato forced Thrasymachus to acknowledge that a statesman's true interest is in his subjects by pointing out that a doctor's interest is in treating his patients. Stated differently, this implies that political leaders' legitimate concerns should be the public interest rather than his own. Plato comes to the conclusion that political knowledge must be concerned to the public interest and good, not just the political agenda. The pragmatic theory of justice. This theory of justice is propounded by Glaucon. He restated Thrasymachus' thesis under three headings. First, he outlined the conventional wisdom regarding the nature and genesis of justice, coming to the conclusion that it is a construct that is the result of convention. He essentially states that position held by contemporary writers of the social contract school, contending that in a state of nature, people are free to do and suffer injustice. They develop regulations to end this miserable situation because they find this state intolerable. The second point made by Glaucon is that people who follow these laws do not under duress rather than because the laws are inherently good. Thirdly, he contended that the unjust man has a better life than a just one. Upon closer examination of these arguments, it can be said that, according to Glaucon, the weaker parties first make a contract with one another, agreeing neither to commit injustice for themselves nor to allow it to be committed to them. This only came to their realization when they felt that they are the victims of more injustice than they can perpetrate. Second, they establish a law in accordance with the contract, the conventions of which are now the norm for behavior and just system. Ultimately, and as a consequence of this agreement and these customs, human nature gives up its true instinct, which is self-satisfaction, and allows itself to be corrupt going forward by the force of the law. Justice is thus the child of fear. It is a mean or compromise between the best of all, which is to do injustice and not to be punished, and the worst of all, which is to suffer injustice without the power of retaliation. Therefore, justice would be based on the instinct of fear and defined as the need of the weaker party, whereas Thrasymachus had grounded it on the instinct for dominance and defined it as the interest of the stronger. He continues to follow Thrasymachus' line of reasoning, but he starts from the opposite end and bases his definition on the fear of the weak rather than the appetite of the strong. As a result, his definition is the opposite of Thrasymachus. However, Plato responds to Glaucon's argument in more straightforward and fundamental way. He recognizes that there is a common element among all the previously considered perspectives, those of Thrasymachus, Glaucon, and Cephalus, and Polemarchus. Rather than carrying justice into the soul or considering it in its proper place, they have all treated it as though it were something external, like an accomplishment, an imputation, or a convention. Thus, he sets out to demonstrate that justice is strong with the majesty of itself and does not rely on chance conventions for its origin or external forces for its validity. Rather, justice is the form everlasting to everlasting. It is the proper station for the human soul, as required by man's very nature when viewed in the context of his surroundings. Justice consequently turns into an internal concept. It is now recognized as an internal grace, and understanding it requires an examination of the inner man, in contrast to Thrasymachus and Glaucon's view that it was something external. Now, Plato's theory of justice. After falsifying all the theories put forth by Glaucon and others, Plato propounds his own theory of justice. Plato states that the question that needs to be answered first is, what is justice? Then one needs to show whether or not justice is intrinsically superior to injustice and, therefore, whether or not human beings ought to be just. Plato suggests that it would be easier to look first at justice in the state than in the individual. The state, says Plato, is simply the individual writ large. Therefore, the virtues possessed by its individuals will be the virtues of the state. Since state represents the individuals in totality, therefore, states Plato, it will be easier to look justice first at the larger picture and then apply the conclusions to the smaller picture of the individual. Therefore, Platonic theory of justice manifests in two dimensions, one at the state level and one at the individual level. The other participants gave concurrence to the Plato's idea. This way, Plato was able to take up a significant portion of Socrates' theory of knowledge for explaining his idea of justice. For the analogy of the state to the individual can work only if justice is something that transcends both and is more universal than either. Acceptance of this view implies the possibility of a true philosophy of justice because, in contrast to Thrasymachus and the sophists, conceptual knowledge of justice is possible if it is a universal concept. Furthermore, Plato's analogy has unintentionally led to agreement on another crucial point. Conversely, morality applied at the individual level can serve as a model for the just man if the just political structure of the state can essentially be the same as socially applied political principle. Stated differently, political science needs to be subfield of ethics and politics need to be of the same material. Furthermore, this means that ethical considerations cannot be separated from political questions, such as what constitutes a just state, in opposition to Thrasymachus and the sophists. Plato begins his discussion of justice in the state by arguing that the state is natural because no individual is self-sufficient. Human beings need each other for being interdependent, and this interdependence brings collective living into existence. As Aristotle has rightly stated that man is by nature a social animal. However, what constitutes social sufficiency? According to Plato, the state is a communion of souls, rationally and necessarily united for the pursuit of a moral end, and rationally and unselfishly guided towards that end by the wisdom of those who know the nature of the soul and the purpose of the world. This means that the state cannot be viewed as the chance congeries of individuals to be exploited by the strongest individuality. According to Plato, it means upholding a suitable division of labor between the different state groups. Three fundamental classes make up Plato's ideal state. The producing class, which manages the state's economy. Plato includes in this group artisans, farmers, traders, and others who provide essential services. Secondly, the warriors in this state are specifically trained and naturally suited for the task of defending the state. Plato refers to them as protectors. Ultimately, the philosopher-ruler will govern the ideal state, carrying out the duties of rulership such as decision-making, policy-making, and so forth. Based on the virtues that predominated in their souls, Plato created these classes. According to Plato, every soul possesses a dominant virtue. For instance, producer's soul possesses the virtue of appetite. Similarly, guardian's soul possesses courage as the dominant virtue, and wisdom is the virtue of the ruling class. There is a hierarchy among these virtues, with wisdom at the top and appetite at the bottom. In a nutshell, the division of labor is a division of virtues, and those who play higher roles are those who have highest virtues. Justice is that people endowed with the highest virtues of wisdom or knowledge should rule. Plato believes in placing good man at the good place and the best man at the highest place. What is then Plato's best state? In response, Plato states that a just state is one in which producers produce, philosophers rule, and guardians keep watch. It is the state in which all three classes uphold the principles of functional specialization and non-interference. Put it in another way, it is the state in which the proper division of virtues and classes is upheld. As a result, justice is the virtue of virtues. It is the virtue of upholding the appropriate balance between temperance, courage, and wisdom. Plato believes that when non-philosophers become rulers, justice ends and injustice begins. As such, a violation will indicate that the proper hierarchy of virtues and classes has collapsed. Politically speaking, this disintegration is akin to class war, in which those ill-suited to rule engage in competition with one another for control. This was going on while Plato was alive. The wealthy sought to repress the poor, while the improvised sought to topple their authority. They only cared about furthering their own class interests and had no regard for justice. In Plato's ideal state, the military and economic classes of the state will submit to a philosophical autocracy, just as the rational part of the mind subordinates appetite and spirit. It is accurate to say that such a state's unity will not be attained by force, just as its class division will not be created or preserved artificially. Since they are both based on the fundamental characteristics of the human nature, they are both, states Plato, based on innate right. According to him, the three-class system and the rule of philosopher kings will be maintained by the knowledge that all citizens have of their obligations and limitations, as well the shared willingness of all citizens to acknowledge their obligations and limitations. Since reason, spirit, and appetite are naturally placed in different propositions within each individual soul. Accordingly, each soul, believes Plato, consists of these three parts. This suggests that each of these components is primarily and specially noticeable in specific people or groups of people, while spirit predominates in a large number of individuals. Reason is prominent in a small number of people, and appetite is paramount in the majority of people. Justice, therefore, requires that everyone correctly understands their station in life and conduct themselves in accordance with their prevailing virtue. It is the role of wisdom to lead, bravery to defend, and appetite to produce. When everyone fulfills their responsibilities in accordance with their individual virtues, justice is achieved. This means that each person should carry out their work in the role to which they have been called by their abilities. According to Plato, an axe that is used to both carve and cut down a tree is mishandled. Similarly, someone who tries to rule their peers when they are only capable of being a passable craftsman is not only mistaken but also unjust. Doubly unjust, in fact, because not only does he fail to perform his own proper work, but he also pushes the better man aside. But how can people know which virtue is dominant in their souls? Plato relies on two important aspects of human personality. He has advocated extensive scheme of education to nurture the nature so as to find out the best personality of the individual. Conclusion. Plato's theory of justice is based on some fundamental principle. In the first place, the Socrates principle, virtue is knowledge, has shaped the entire political philosophy of Plato. Further, functional specialization and non-interference are used as basic principles for a just order. Justice cannot be associated with conventional morality, neither can it be achieved by domination or fear. It has to evolve from within the individual and from within the states. Plato's theory of justice is not without its criticisms. Some have labeled it as totalitarian justice, while others have raised their doubts that such a theory tends to produce a polity which can be accused both of excessive separatism and of what Aristotle calls excessive unification. With this, we come to conclusion of today's lecture. Thank you for watching.